There are people in life who don't show up to build anything with you, they show up to take from what you've already built. At first, it doesn't look harmful. In fact, it can even feel like connection. They're in your conversations, they respond to your messages, they know how to appear engaged. But if you observe closely, a pattern starts to reveal itself. They are always arriving at your door when they need something, and rarely, if ever, present when you need anything in return. Psychologically, this isn't random behavior, it's conditioning. The consistent taker operates on a very simple internal logic. Relationships are transactional, but only in one direction. They learn, often unconsciously, that if they apply just enough charm, urgency, or emotional appeal, they can access your time, energy, or resources. And because most decent people are wired for empathy, they comply. Not because they are weak, but because they are responsive. Over time, this dynamic creates a distortion in your perception. You begin to confuse their need for you with genuine connection. You start to believe that being needed is the same as being valued. But there's a critical difference. Value is reciprocal. Need is extractive. One builds mutual respect, the other quietly depletes it. What makes the consistent taker particularly difficult to recognize early on is that they rarely take everything at once. They take in small, socially acceptable increments. A favor here, emotional support there, a bit of your time when you're busy. It feels manageable, even reasonable. But psychologically, this is how boundaries are eroded, not through force, but through repetition without balance. And if you ever stop giving, you'll notice something important. They don't reflect. They don't adjust. They simply disappear until the next need arises. That's the pattern. Not connection, but access. At a deeper level, what you are dealing with is not just a person, but a behavioral model that never evolved past consumption. And the danger is not just what they take from you, but what you slowly normalize about yourself while allowing it. Because every time you overextend for someone who would never reciprocate, you are teaching your mind that imbalance is acceptable. And that is where the real cost begins, not in what they take from you, but in what you stop expecting for yourself. So the question becomes simple but not easy. Are you building relationships, or are you maintaining access points for people who only arrive when they need to take something from your life? Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't unsee it again. There's a certain type of person who can keep you emotionally engaged for years without ever actually changing anything in their life. On the surface, they sound self-aware. They can describe their pain in detail, they can explain their patterns, they can even identify what went wrong in past situations. But if you pay attention long enough, you notice something inconsistent. Their story evolves, but their behavior doesn't. This is the chronic victim. Psychologically, the chronic victim is not just someone who experiences hardship. Everyone goes through difficulty. The difference is responsibility. The chronic victim builds an identity around being wronged, misunderstood, or repeatedly unlucky, but rarely arrives at the point where ownership enters the picture. Life is always something happening to them, never something they are actively shaping. And this creates a very subtle but powerful dynamic in relationships. At first, you feel compassion. That's normal. Empathy is a healthy human response. You want to help. You want to support. You want to believe that if they just had stability, understanding, or encouragement, things would shift. So you invest energy. You listen more. You give more. You adjust your expectations. But over time, something becomes clear. Your support is not a bridge to change. It becomes part of their comfort zone. Because if you are always there to absorb their emotional weight, they are never forced to confront it themselves. And this is where the psychological trap forms. The chronic victim doesn't reject responsibility aggressively. They avoid it passively, through sadness, through confusion, through endless explanation. And because they often appear vulnerable rather than hostile, it becomes difficult to set boundaries without feeling like you are abandoning them. But here's the deeper truth. You cannot rescue someone from a pattern they are emotionally invested in maintaining. Because their identity is often built around the story of struggle, not the resolution of it. So even when opportunities for change appear, they unconsciously return to familiar ground. The problem is no longer just external, it becomes structural in their thinking. Responsibility feels heavier than suffering, so suffering becomes the default position. And if you stay in that dynamic long enough, something starts to happen to you. You begin to feel responsible for their stability. You start measuring your actions by how they will feel, not whether anything is actually changing. And slowly, without noticing it, you become part of the system that keeps them unchanged. At some point, you have to recognize a difficult distinction. Supporting someone is not the same as carrying someone who refuses to stand, because growth requires discomfort, and accountability cannot be outsourced. And the hardest truth is this: when someone repeatedly avoids responsibility, they are not stuck in their life, you are being pulled into it. So the real question becomes not how much more you can give, but how long you are willing to participate in a cycle that mistakes explanation for progress. Because until responsibility enters the story, nothing ever truly changes, only the excuses do. Some people don't manipulate in obvious ways. They don't need anger, aggression, or confrontation. In fact, the most effective manipulation often arrives dressed as reason, care, or emotional intelligence. That's what makes it so difficult to detect early on. It doesn't feel like control, it feels like connection. This is the manipulator in disguise. At a psychological level, this type of person is not simply trying to win in interactions. They are trying to manage outcomes without appearing responsible for them. They don't state needs directly. Instead, they shape your perception until you arrive at the conclusion they wanted in the first place. They guide rather than demand. They suggest rather than ask. And when that doesn't work, they shift into guilt, subtle pressure, or emotional withdrawal. What makes this especially complex is that they often understand human emotion very well, not in an empathetic sense, but in a strategic sense. They know what triggers guilt. They know what creates obligation. They know how to position themselves as the reasonable one, even when the dynamic is deeply uneven. And because of that, the relationship can feel strangely self-driven on your side. You start making decisions on your own, but if you look closely, those decisions are already shaped by the emotional environment they've created. You're not being told what to do, you're being guided toward it. Over time, this creates a psychological distortion. You begin to question your own perception. If conflict arises, you may feel like you're overreacting. If something feels unfair, you may assume you misunderstood. Because the manipulator rarely presents themselves as openly controlling, you start to internalize the imbalance as your own sensitivity rather than their influence. And that's the key mechanism. Subtle reversal of responsibility. You end up carrying emotional weight that was never fully yours, while they maintain the appearance of calm control. In many cases, they also use inconsistency as a tool. Warm one moment, distant the next. Supportive in private, detached in public. This creates emotional uncertainty, and uncertainty increases psychological dependency. The mind naturally tries to stabilize what feels unpredictable, often by investing more attention, more patience, more emotional effort. But here is the critical point. Manipulation doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like confusion that never resolves. And if you stay in that dynamic long enough, you stop reacting to reality and start reacting to patterns they control. Your boundaries become flexible. Your clarity becomes negotiable. And your emotional baseline shifts without you noticing. The real danger is not that they overpower you. It's that they slowly rewrite the internal rules you use to judge what is normal. So the question is not whether they are persuasive. The question is whether your decisions still belong to you when they are in your life. Because once influence replaces clarity, choice is no longer fully yours, it is being guided from behind the scenes. And the moment you recognize that shift, you also recognize this. Control doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply teaches you not to question it. There is a particular pattern in human behavior that often gets misunderstood as mistakes or moments of weakness, when in reality, it reflects something much deeper: repetition without consequence. When someone crosses a boundary once, it can be an error. But when the same pattern repeats, it stops being an accident and starts becoming identity. This is the repeated betrayer. At a psychological level, betrayal is not always about dramatic actions. It can be small violations of trust, inconsistencies in loyalty, or repeated disregard for agreements that were clearly understood. What matters is not the size of the action, but the absence of correction afterward. Because correction is what defines awareness. Without it, behavior becomes habit. The repeated betrayer often operates under a very specific internal framework. Access is assumed and forgiveness is expected. They rely on a psychological safety net created by the other person's patience, empathy, or history with them. So instead of change, they lean into reassurance that things will go back to normal without requiring them to fundamentally adjust their behavior. And this is where the dynamic becomes dangerous, not because of one betrayal, but because of the normalization of it. Each time trust is broken and then restored without real accountability, the emotional system adapts. The mind begins to reduce sensitivity to violation. What once felt unacceptable starts to feel familiar, and familiarity, over time, can start to feel like stability, even when it is not. That's the subtle shift. Your standards don't collapse suddenly, they erode quietly. From the perspective of the repeated betrayer, this creates a feedback loop with no cost. If there is no consequence, there is no reason to change. If access remains unchanged after violation, the system teaches them that trust is flexible and repair is automatic. In that environment, behavior rarely evolves because evolution requires pressure. Without pressure, patterns persist. But there is another layer here that is often overlooked. Staying in a cycle of repeated betrayal doesn't just affect how you see them, it affects how you see them, it affects how you see yourself. You begin to question your judgment. You start rationalizing inconsistencies. You start negotiating with your own internal sense of what is acceptable. And slowly, your emotional boundaries become reactive instead of defined. At that point, the relationship is no longer built on trust, it is built on recovery. And recovery without change becomes exhaustion. Because you are not dealing with one event anymore, you are dealing with a pattern that has learned it can reset without consequence. So the critical question is not whether someone is sorry. It is whether their behavior has ever been required to change in a lasting way. Because without consequence, there is no correction. And without correction, there is no transformation, only repetition with better excuses. And the moment you realize that, you understand something essential. Trust is not built on forgiveness alone, it is built on the willingness to stop repeating what breaks it. There are people who don't drain you in obvious ways. They don't argue, they don't betray, they don't even necessarily harm you in a direct sense. Instead, they create something far more subtle and far more exhausting, a relationship where nothing you do ever feels like it's enough. This is the emotional black hole. At first, you interpret it as depth. You think you're dealing with someone complex, someone sensitive, someone who simply needs more understanding, more patience, more care. So you give more. You listen longer. You adjust your tone. You soften your boundaries. You try different approaches, different levels of support, different forms of reassurance. And for a moment, it seems to help. There might even be relief, gratitude, or emotional closeness. But it never stabilizes. The satisfaction never holds. Because the core issue is not what you are giving. It is the absence of a point where enough exists. Psychologically, the emotional black hole operates through a shifting baseline. Whatever level of attention, care, or validation you provide becomes the new minimum expectation almost immediately. Not because they are consciously manipulative in all cases, but because their internal emotional system is structured around dissatisfaction as a constant state. Relief is temporary, and need is permanent. And so the cycle continues. You give, they absorb. You adjust, they recalibrate. You improve your effort, and the standard quietly moves again. It creates a dynamic where progress is always visible in the moment, but never accumulative over time. The danger here is not just exhaustion, it is distortion, because in this environment your mind starts to misinterpret the problem. You begin to assume that if you just communicate better, love harder, support more intelligently, or show up more consistently, things will eventually stabilize. You start treating imbalance as a technical issue instead of a structural one. But some systems are not waiting for optimization. They are built around perpetual intake. And the longer you stay in that pattern, the more your own emotional reference point begins to shift. You start measuring your worth by their satisfaction, even though their satisfaction is not a stable metric. You start to feel responsible for emotional states you did not create and cannot permanently fix. And slowly, your internal sense of adequacy becomes externally controlled. This is where people often confuse attachment with responsibility. You feel close, so you feel accountable. You care, so you overfunction. But care without limits turns into depletion, and responsibility for another person's emotional infinity becomes a role no one can actually fulfill. At some point, you have to confront a difficult truth. Not all emptiness is meant to be filled. Some patterns are structured in a way that your effort only defines how much you lose, not how much they gain. And when nothing is ever enough, the real question is no longer what more you can do, it is why you are still trying to complete something that was never designed to be complete. Because in relationships like this, the finish line does not move because you are improving. It moves because it was never placed in the first place. And once you see that clearly, you understand something essential. You cannot restore balance in a system that only knows how to consume it. There is a type of person who doesn't break you through obvious harm. They don't necessarily insult you, abandon you, or betray you in a dramatic way. Instead, their influence is far more gradual. It shows up in how you start editing yourself around them, how you begin to question your instincts, how your confidence becomes slightly quieter every time you interact with them. This is the identity destroyer. Psychologically, this pattern is often subtle because it doesn't start with rejection, it starts with influence. Small comments that question your choices, light sarcasm about your ambitions, realistic feedback that consistently leans toward limitation rather than expansion. At first, it can be framed as care, even concern. They might say they are just being honest or trying to protect you from disappointment. But over time, the consistent direction of that influence becomes clear, not toward your growth, but toward your containment. And containment is not always aggressive. Sometimes it is quiet. It sounds like caution when you are trying to move forward. It sounds like doubt when you are trying to trust yourself. It sounds like reason when you are trying to take a risk. And because it is often delivered in a calm, familiar voice, you start to internalize it as logic instead of limitation. The deeper psychological effect here is identity erosion. You don't feel like you are being stopped. You feel like you are deciding not to proceed. That is what makes it powerful. The resistance is no longer external, it becomes internalized. And slowly, your behavioral range begins to shrink. You start avoiding ideas you would have once explored. You delay decisions you would have once made quickly. You begin to second-guess desires that were once clear. Not because they are wrong, but because they are now filtered through another person's perspective. Over time, this creates a distortion in self-perception. You begin to mistake hesitation for intelligence. You confuse self-doubt with maturity. You label expansion as recklessness and restraint as wisdom. And without realizing it, your internal definition of what you are capable of starts aligning with their limitations instead of your potential. The most important part of this pattern is that it rarely announces itself as control. It often presents as helping you stay grounded. But grounding in its healthy form stabilizes you without shrinking you. This, instead, reduces your horizon. And when someone consistently makes you feel like you are too much when you expand or not realistic enough when you dream, they are not just commenting on your behavior, they are shaping your identity boundaries. Because identity is not only what you believe about yourself, it is also what you stop yourself from becoming under certain influences. And that is the silent cost here. Not that you are directly prevented from growing, but that you begin to participate in your own reduction. So the real question becomes simple but confronting. After spending time with this person, do you feel more certain about who you are or more cautious about who you are allowed to be? Because the clearest sign of identity erosion is not confusion. It is hesitation in places where clarity once existed. And once you recognize that, you understand something fundamental. Not every voice in your life is meant to shape your direction. Some voices, if left unchecked, quietly reshape your limits instead. And the moment your limits start sounding like someone else's opinions, you are no longer expanding, you are being rewritten.